I'd like to read a book to you. And it's called The Church Mouse. This is a lot of fun. In a busy little town, not very far away, there is a church. And in the church, there lived a mouse whose name was Arthur. Arthur liked living in a church. For one thing, he was very fond of music, particularly if it was loud. Also, if the verger had filled the font, he could go and mess about in his boat, or practice the crawl if the weather was warm enough. But he liked it best because it was safe. Samson, the church cat, had listened to so many sermons about the meek being blessed and everybody really being brothers that he had grown quite frighteningly meek and treated Arthur just like a brother. But sometimes Arthur got a bit depressed. One reason for this was his diet. All he ever had to eat were sweets the boys dropped during choir practice. You might say that it wouldn't make you depressed, but you are not a mouse. It made Arthur fat and bilious, and it didn't do his teeth any good either. But worst of all, he was lonely. For in the whole church, there was not one other mouse. And when he felt like having a chat, Samson always seemed to be having one of his little day-long naps. Then one afternoon, when he was reading, an idea popped into his head. And, as the parson was at that very moment passing by, Arthur told him about it. The parson rather liked the idea. At least he said he was willing to give it a try. For a moment, Arthur was quite carried away. Then, not being a mouse to let the grass grow under his feet, he rushed out of the church and into the town to put his idea into practice. And what an awful place the town was! Much worse than he had imagined. He's going to get stepped on. He almost gave up his idea, but then he thought, if it's always as nasty as this, he almost got run over. Everybody is bound to agree to my plan. So he hurried on. That dog's almost getting him, huh? And only paused once all the rest of the way. Why did he stop there?
More food.
Cheese! Lots of cheese. He went into the first likely-looking house he came to, knocked at the mouse hole, and introduced himself to the mouse who answered. Straightway she asked him in to meet her husband, for she knew that anybody who lived in a church must be a pretty decent sort of person. Over tea they chatted about life and things, but Arthur could see that his new companions were a bit down in the dumps. After tea they took Arthur on a tour of the premises. "Look at that thing," they grumbled. "People leave them lying about, and they can be dangerous." What's that? Mousetrap. "And stop that this minute!" the mouse mother suddenly shouted. "You could be electrocuted." The babies are sticking their paws in the outlet. That's not safe, huh? Furthermore, the house cat had not heard of brotherly love. They had to flee for their lives back to the hole. "We just don't know what things are coming to," they said to Arthur. They were obviously in the right frame of mind for Arthur's idea, which he explained. "It's beautiful!" they both exclaimed. "We'll invite everyone round this evening to hear about it." Oh, look at all the mice. So that evening, when everybody had assembled and stopped shuffling and coughing, Arthur stood up, cleared his throat, and began, without any beating around the bush. "My idea is this. You all come and live at the church. It's warm, quiet, and I've got Samson, the church cat, right under my thumb. Almost. The parson says if we do a few odd jobs, we'll be paid in cheese, best quality. He's expecting us tomorrow morning if you want to come. Everybody thought the idea simply splendid, except the schoolmouse, who said something about Arthur thinking he was the Pied Piper of Hampstead or somewhere. But everybody shushed him. A vote was taken on what kinds of cheese the parson should buy, and the result was 100 for Cheddar, 99 for Cheshire, 70 for Wensleydale, 50 for Caerphilly, 42 for something with holes in it that no one could pronounce, 30 for Walnut Whirls, but that was discounted because the voters were underage, and 1 for Afghanistan goat's milk cheese. That was ignored because it was only the schoolmouse trying to be clever. Next morning, all the mice pinned up forwarding addresses and followed Arthur to their new home. So here they come into the church. 1 or 2 things took some getting used to. Like, cat! But, on the whole, everything went very well. The mice kept their half of the bargain and worked quite hard every day. They made sure that the flowers were always fresh and artistically arranged. They polished the congregation's shoes while they listened to the sermon. If there was a wedding, they all went outside to pick up the confetti. And if anyone had thrown rice, they picked that up too and made a big rice pudding for supper. After his 4th helping, the schoolmouse always said he would have preferred a good risotto. But everyone just laughed. See them picking up confetti? And the little ones are playing in it. The young ones were still sulking about the walnut whirl business, so Arthur let them tidy up after the church boys. They're getting the candy. As for polishing the brasses, everybody loved that because they could sneak glances at their reflections without appearing vain. So see, they're polishing the shiny stuff. Look, they're using Samson's tail to polish. And he's dragging. The parson kept his half of the bargain too. Each Friday he put the different kinds of cheese in the vestry. The schoolmouse was given another chance to choose and asked for Edam. Not because he liked it, he said, but because its beautiful red crust appealed to his artistic nature. Everybody just smiled, particularly when he made himself sick by eating too much of it. And see, there's the red one there. Every evening, after supper, the grown-ups sat around the vestry stove and took turns frightening each other with horrible stories about dogs. They meant cats, really. But they always said dogs so as not to hurt Samson's feelings. Samson himself did babysitting, and they didn't mind a bit about hurting his feelings, or any other part of him for that matter. Look, they're tying bows on his whiskers, pulling on his whiskers, and yelling in his ear, pulling on his ear, tying his legs together. They're putting his tail in glue. Oh my. Oh, and they're going to dump ink on him. Oh boy. But one Sunday, during the Harvest Festival service, a terrible thing happened. Samson, who had suffered a very bad night with the young mice, dropped off during the sermon and dreamt he was back in the days before he was reformed. Uh-oh. He's chasing the mice. Look at him running across people's heads on the organ. When he woke up, he found he was not dreaming. He was chasing mice all over the church. It took a bit of time to remember about brotherly love, and by that time, it was too late. Look, he's knocking down all the vegetables, and it's falling on people's heads. Look, a pumpkin fell right on that guy's head. All the people had started to walk angrily out of the church. Nothing the parson could do would stop them. One of them said, "Either get rid of those vermin." All the mice gasped, for no one had called them that before, at least not to their faces. "Or we'll never come back." And what's more, they'd better not try coming back to their old holes, because they'll be blocked up and there will be a real cat. Here, Samson gasped, waiting for them. When the church was empty, everyone turned on Samson. "That's what comes of sleeping through the sermon," the parson said reproachfully. "I'd heard it before," mumbled Samson. But when he saw the parson's hurt look, he added quickly, "Well, something like it anyway." "It was all working out so nicely," the parson went on sadly. "But as it is, you'll have to go in the morning. A church is no good without a congregation, is it?" Samson looks really sad, doesn't he? Everybody's really mad. That night, the mice all sat around the vestry stove with their backs turned on Samson and Arthur, except for the schoolmouse, who pointed his finger at Samson and said that he'd always said, though no one could remember him breathing a word of it before, that Samson was a leopard in sheep's clothing, and that a wolf couldn't change its spots, and anyway, cats were all birds of a feather, and so was Arthur for that matter. To his surprise, everyone agreed with him for once, but only because nobody could think of anything nastier to say on the spur of the moment. So they're all mad at him and leaving him out. But meanwhile, something very, very fishy was going on. Look at that. Man's breaking into the church. A robber. Samson's sharp ears soon let him know about it. He prowled into the transept, but was back in a jiffy. "Come and look," he hissed at Arthur. He sounded so excited that all the other mice, who had been pretending not to listen, came out of their sulks and followed Samson and Arthur to see what was up. A man was taking the candlesticks off the altar. They knew he must be a terrible chap, because he hadn't bothered to take his hat off in church. The candlesticks had cost £222, 22.5 new pence each. The townsfolk's grandfathers had saved their farthings. Their fathers had saved their halfpennies, and they had saved their new pennies to buy them. Some people loved them so much they only came to church to make sure they were still there. "He's stealing them," the mice whispered to each other. But the schoolmouse said in a quaking voice that a man wasn't guilty until proved innocent, and hadn't they best go back to the vestry and think about it calmly, because desertion was the better part of valor. But Arthur and Samson knew they must do something, even though they had all been sacked. Arthur stepped forward with a fairly resolute expression on his face. "Follow me. Be very, 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 very," Samson gave him a little push. "Very quiet," he whispered. Fortunately, the burglar was wasting time gloating over the candlesticks. Everybody tiptoed closer. So here they are, all sneaking up on the robber. Arthur tied the burglar's bootlaces together. He had to do it himself because Samson could only tie granny knots. So Samson's holding him by the tail and he's tying the bootlaces. Then Samson obliged with his party piece. It was supposed to be the Song of the Nightingale, but everyone else thought it sounded like a policeman's whistle. They counted on the burglar thinking so too. So he's whistling. He did. In his haste to escape the police, or as Samson insisted later, to get outside to see the nightingale, he dropped his sack, spun around, and took a great big stride. Or rather, he would have if his bootlaces hadn't been tied together. He fell down. It worried them a bit when he landed on his head, because they thought he might have broken some of the tiles the parson was so proud of. But it turned out there were just a few cracks. As for the burglar himself, he appeared to be sleeping like a baby. Knocked him right out. Everybody had the idea of rolling him up in the carpet. At any rate, everybody said it was their idea afterwards. They all put their shoulders to the carpet and pushed. The schoolmouse said to the mouse beside him that he felt like a Lilliputian, but the mouse replied huffily that he couldn't stand foreign food, because he was just an average English working mouse, and he felt like a cheese in a chutney sandwich. And the mouse next to him said he felt like a bread and butter pudding. And Samson said he felt like a mouse casserole, and he'd have one too if they didn't shut up and push. Suddenly the burglar woke up and started shouting words that even the schoolmouse had never heard before. Then he began to struggle, and the mice had to strain to stop him unrolling himself. "Do something!" they shouted at Arthur. Said Arthur decisively. Then the schoolmouse butted in. "There's only one thing to do," he said. "We must ring the bells and summon help." But by then Arthur was master of the situation. "There's only one thing to do," he cried. "We must ring the bells and summon help. Half of you follow me to the bell tower." And with that he dashed off like a born leader, except that he went in the wrong direction. And by the time he realized his mistake, the others were halfway there. So he had to pretend he had stayed in the rear to help hurry stragglers along. When he caught up, he found everybody staring in dismay at the bell ropes, which were tied up, well out of reach. "Now what?" they cried. Said Arthur without hesitation. The schoolmouse butted in again, saying that Samson could climb on the back of a chair and reach one of the ropes. But Samson hadn't forgotten the nasty names the schoolmouse had called him in the vestry. "Wolves and spotted sheep feathers aren't very good at climbing on the backs of chairs," he mumbled sarcastically. However, Arthur had seized up the situation. "Samson," he said briskly, "will climb on the back of the chair and reach one of the ropes." But it was no good. So there's Arthur, and there's Samson reaching, but he can't reach, can he? Then a mouse who had lived in the local theater made a shy suggestion. "I don't know whether it can be done without sky blue tights with sequins on them," he added, "but we could try." So they did, and it worked. Look at them, they all made a pyramid standing on each other. And now they can reach the rope. And they rang the bells until they thought everyone within a radius of 10 miles must be awake. Look at them pulling on the rope. Whoa! The townsfolk tumbled out of bed, shouting things like, "Earthquake! Martians! Flood! Plague! Escaped rhinoceros! Anarchists! Apaches! Fire! The end of the world! Locusts! Vikings! Burst pipe! Students! Mad hedgehog! Icebergs!" But soon everybody was racing towards the church. When they saw how near they had come to losing their beautiful candlesticks, the townsfolk got very peevish with the burglar. They seemed to think that he had got himself rolled up in the carpet through trying to steal that too. But Arthur soon told them how to stretch a point, he and his friends and Samson had trapped the burglar. And after that, of course, there was no talk of their having to leave the church. The parson pointed out that the mice had earned their keep for at least 50 years by saving the candlesticks, and because of that, they needn't bother doing any more chores. But all the mice, or to be honest, a few of them anyhow, said they would prefer to keep on working, since it was best to keep the mind occupied. The schoolmouse let it be known that he was quite prepared to take the more advanced Sunday school classes in philosophy, horticulture, and train spotting, but everybody just sighed. As for Samson, you might think he was very sorry about his lapse, but you would be wrong, because he wasn't. The mice had been taking him a bit for granted of late, he thought, and the fact that they were frivolous, giddy creatures was no excuse. They'd learned he was not to be trifled with, and after that, whenever they needed reminding, he would just yawn and say he hoped he wouldn't drop off during the sermon. And then there would be no more giggling and tittering over silly jokes about dogs for at least 2 days. The end. Was that a funny story? I hope you enjoyed it.